Hello and welcome back to the rise and fall of the Chill Out Room, a history of ambient house and ambient techno 1989 to 1996. Today I will be finally wrapping up 1994. In the last video we looked at Apollo and their more IDM leaning sounds from the year. Of course it wasn't just them releasing bleak rhythm forward music, indeed Warp was one of the hubs of this sound. The label opened the year with Richard H. Kirk's Virtual State. With Cabaret Voltaire's final album, The Conversation, due out on Apollo later in the year, and Kirk's side projects Sandoz and Electric Eye also having albums lined up, it was a busy year for the Sheffield musician. Nevertheless, this release has received a particularly high level attention due to its appearance on Warp. While the dark paranoia of much of Kirk's music is present, there's also a lightness of touch. This is lonely music, nocturnal and stark, conjuring images of wastelands, but the use of occasionally playful melodies and ethnic samples lends it a vibe that also fits in with ambient house. An incredibly original, transitional record that appeals to a range of listeners. Later in the year, Kirk's dub project Sandoz released its debut album Intensely Radioactive, a rare example of experimental labelled touch appearing in this series. Tonally similar to Virtual State, the album offers a mixture of brighter and darker synth melodies, ethnic samples, and deep dub bass lines. The tempos are faster and the drums hit harder, making it only loosely connected to ambient, but it's excellent further listening for fans of Kirk's solo record of the same year. 94 brought Warp's Artificial Intelligence series to a close with the Artificial Intelligence 2 compilation. Branching out further than the initial set, this release features a number of non-Warp artists, including the Higher Intelligence Agency, Beaumont Hannant, Global Communications, Scammer and Daryl Fitton, later known as Bowler, alongside new signings Kenny Larkin, Richard H. Kirk and Seefeel, plus new tracks from Volume 1 artists B12, Autechre, Speedy J, Polygon Window and The Black Dog. With more than a year between the two compilations, in many cases the production quality has gone up a notch, and this set feels much closer to the kind of sound people think of in terms of early IDM. It's actually an incredibly consistent set, my second favourite AI release behind IQ Nebula, and it's hard to pick standouts, although the Link Global Communication track is one of their finest, and Beaumont Hannant, on his own and remixing Mark Franklin, provides melodic goodness in spades. My favourite might have to be Speedy J's Symmetry, however, which soars on epic bliss for its 6-minute runtime and is a rare case of a non-dance floor oriented track from Yeochen Parp. Starting brightly, the set gradually sinks into a darker sound, with Daryl Fitton, Polygon Window and Kenny Larkin all providing moodier pieces to end on, with Scammer's hidden track being a paranoid slice of his possibly questionable phone snooping music. After being championed by Aphex twins, Seefeel signed to Warp, and their only release of 94 was the Starethrough EP. Anyone expecting more of the warm, uplifting, dubby shoegaze of their debut would have been left more than a little disappointed by the unearthly drones and dull, clanging metallic drums found here. Only Spangle, with its semi-prominent guitars and vocals, is reminiscent of the group's earlier style. The ecstasy of St. Teresa's 3D, a mix of shoegaze and ambient house collaging, might have offered at least something of what earlier Seefeel fans might have been after. Autechre may not be as fond of amber as the albums surrounding it. It was created with this particular ambient IDM sound in mind, rather than coming completely naturally. It is a tremendous record in its own right. Significantly darker than the group's debut, here Booth and Brown create a less welcoming landscape, one of abandoned quarries and industrial workings, lights flickering on the horizon. Opener Foil sets the scene, led by slowly filtering drums and paranoid synth drones. Montreal sets up the kind of cyclical melodies that will become the group's hallmark over their next few releases, while Glitch lives up to its title, with squawking amelodic synths and clicking, clattering percussion. Near the end of the record, Yulquen approaches a ghastly near silence, bubbling away at the edge of hearing, while Tear or Tear or Tear or Tear is full of foreboding, growling synths and industrial hip-hop loops hinting at directions to come in Autechre's future. It's not all so grim. Slip is full of the playful melodies the group sometimes pretend they aren't experts at. 9 is beatless melancholic synth bliss, and Further and Nil call to mind the ambient electro of IQ Nebula's most melodic moments. And then there's Piezo, a career highlight. Opening on layers of skittering metallic percussion, the piece eventually crumbles away into a vast ocean of minor key synth pads. One of the most visceral pieces of music I've ever heard. I can almost see the distant city lights go by in the night every time I listen to it. A contender for my top 20 pieces of music of all time, Piezo is also my favourite Autechre track. Or maybe an attempt to continue the ambient style of the time, Amber finds Sean and Rob instead beginning to truly plough their own furrow, offering a colder, more mechanical yet no less beautiful sound than their debut, and pointing towards braver experiments of the future. The album's accompanying anti-EP with its criminal justice bill baiting Flutter, a track without a single repeated bar throughout its runtime, thus circumventing the then proposed law banning gatherings playing music with repetitive beats, paved the way for the more rhythmically complex world IDM was steering towards. And as part of the anonymous Guestgom collective, they helped create an EP that, although containing ambient techno bliss and cicada, was more defined by the harshness of the remaining 3 tracks. This was the second release on Scam Records, the first being by Lego Feet, a very early alias of the band. Scam would go on to become a key player in IDM later in the decade. 1994 was a big year for Beaumont Hannant, who released 3 albums on GPR, 2 of them under the same name. The main Texturology album, one released both as CD and double vinyl, is the more atmospheric of the two, with wonderful melodic pieces like Crouton and Mind Colours, while his rhythms are coldly digital, occasionally veering on the industrial, such as on the computer glitches of woven textures and the tough snares of Shades of Haze. Overall, the album plays out like a starker, colder but more melodic version of Autechre's Amber, broadly ambient leaning but with an icy heart. The vinyl-only partner album is its rhythm-forward cousin, with harsher and faster beats taking the fore throughout. Ambient is much further away this time around. His third album of the year, Sculptured, explores several new avenues, such as vocals, of the guest vocalist singing lyrics variety, in the form of Lyda mu-ziq, a singer who will go on to work with Hannant in coming years with their mu-ziq-esque project on Night Ride and Ormo, bouncy trip-hop in the form of Departure, bleepy electro on Indecision, live guitar and bass in the post-punk IDM crossover Autumn, and the synth jazz improv of No Secret. Meanwhile, even the straight-up IDM, like the abstract rhythmic experiments of Touch Your Skin, are a world away from the blissful melodies of Hannant's earlier material. Though he hasn't decided exactly which avenue he wishes to follow, the artist has made a clear move away from the ambient IDM of only a few months earlier. In similar territory, on the same label and releasing 2 albums in '94, was Luke Slater with his Seventh Plane project. One of the UK's earliest techno practitioners, Slater's work as a Seventh Plane is darker and mellower than a lot of the music is associated with, and was at the time championed by the likes of Mixmaster Morris. Nevertheless, the coldness and crisp metallics of the beats on both The Four-Cornered Room and My Yellow Wise Rug are in that transitional spot where Detroit techno was becoming IDM without any other ambient house influence. On the subject of techno legends, Joey Beltram's 1994 album Aonox exists in this weird IDM hinterland where genre-bending oddities converged before stylistic guidelines existed. It's an exceptionally dark album with brooding paranoid synths and slow malignant beats coated in cavernous reverb. Sometimes we get acid, such as on Kirk, while the percussion samples in South Pacific even have a tenuous link to tribal ambient, but the feeling here is all its own, a uniquely harrowing experience that should be avoided as a post-rave come-down album at all costs. With some tonal similarity to darker early works by Aphex Twin and Alec Empire, the album has more in common with the up-and-coming Isolationism movement of dark ambient drone than other ambient techno of the era, and this makes it an incredibly memorable record, even if one that requires a very specific mood to be fully appreciated. There were plenty of Warp-adjacent artists providing similar music in '94, as IDM began to become the go-to sound. Mike Paradinas' most famous project, mu-ziq, released its debut album Tengo and Vective on Reflex in '93, and '94's follow-up Bluff Limbo was considered a companion album. Bluff Limbo finds Paradinas really developing his own sound. The debut always felt a little too much like Aphex Light to me, and features early examples of his tremendous ear for melody. Ria Stand is particularly gorgeous, but other than Sick Porter, he never succumbs to the temptation of making easy-going music, with everything containing at least some confrontational element. We previously met the Van Elsen brothers for Transform's superb debut album Sublunar Oracles back in 1992. Before releasing the follow-up to that, the pair created the alias Brain Pilot and released a self-titled album on Nova Zembla. The pair here are clearly less bothered about ambience, although the record is a fine home listening album nevertheless. However, they have clearly moved back to the dance floor with a mixture of techno, deep house, occasional trancey synths, and even hints of drum and bass on EEG. The uplifting Implant is an ambient techno gem, and Insight's trip-hop inspired beats combined with the pair's ear for melody to create a marvellous down-tempo number. It closes on the darker sounding Matrix, a beatless piece that acts as a reminder that the pair are as good at ambient as they are techno. There are also plenty of other albums from '94 that find producers creating dark, experimental techno IDM crossovers. Examples include Lemon Soul's Environmental Architecture, Germ's Gone, Alec Empire's Limited Editions 90-94, RIC's Distance, Elfish Echo's Multiple Void Enjoyment, Sensorial's Never to Tell a Soul, David Christian's Synesthesia, Black Lungs, The Depopulation Bomb, the list goes on and on. For a couple of years, the experimental electronica world was entirely ambient centred, but by '94 an alternative had arrived and it was poised to take over. Oh yes, and then there's Aphex Twin's Selected Ambient Works Volume 2. It was met with a baffled reception at the time, with some declaring it a piss take on fans, a deliberately obtuse work of abstraction designed to alienate listeners. Of course, it's nothing of the sort. Ambient Works 2 is a masterpiece of largely beatless ambience, closer to Eno's On Land than maybe anything released since, echoing the frequently bleak synth lines of Richard D. James's extreme acid and techno work, but without the beats. Hypnotic loops of sinister keyboards, disembodied vocal snippets and other unnerving samples. It's the soundtrack to a dank, rainy countryside somewhere miles from civilization. While it's not all heavy going, Rhubarb, I'm going with the fan-created titles here, is heartbreaking, maybe James's most beautiful piece, while Blue Calx brings back the dreamy ambience of the first ambient works is Far, and Z-Twig, Lichen and Hexagon are all warm and welcoming. But for the most part, this is an album of haunted woodlands, abandoned churches, creepy graveyards, spirits and movements seen out the corner of your eye. In other words, it's a world away from the broader public perception of ambient in '94. What it actually does is preempt the isolationism scene that would develop over '94 into '95 and onwards, where ambient will return to its roots of formless, beatless sonic texture, albeit in a much bleaker sense. The album is an absolute masterpiece and an all-time top 5 for me, but unlike Selected Ambient Works 85 to 92, which was a hallmark of the ambient techno era, Volume 2 is its death knell. Ambient was no longer friendly. One thing that didn't help the fortunes of ambient was the rise of cash-in releases. The Chill Out compilation, bane of any ambient fan, started to appear in '94. There was even the first classical crossover with Chill Out Classics Volume 1, described on the back cover as a soundscape of ambient classical music, released on the creatively named Chill Out label. Meanwhile, the new age obsession with whales and dolphins found its way into the ambient house world, such as the terrible chill-out house crossover of Aura's citation songs for the whales, labelled as Proclaims from Metaphysical House No. 1. And then there's The Voyage of the Whales by Transmission, or Leviathan by Leviathan. Both the same album, released in Germany under completely different names, by tiny trance label Pyramid and by Music and Sound, a label specialising in budget compilations of lesser known material by classic pop artists and electronic music collections largely made by in-house producers to cash in on current trends. Opener Lost Paradise 2 is a surprisingly effective piece of ambient trance, but the album generally plays out as cheap, uninspired and cynical. A similar set called Ambient Definitions, released on XXP Records, featured new tracks recorded by a collective of largely Eurodance related acts whose attempts at ambient are okay but pointless. Even library music companies got in on the game, with Pete Giles and Pat Milne's Ambient House collection for Studio G, meaning daytime TV and local radio could be soundtracked by a selection of fresh and neatly crafted tracks performed in such styles as ambient, trance, club, house, dub, techno and dance. Danny's speech from Withnail and I about hippie wigs being sold in Woolworths feels very relevant at this point. Of course, not all compilations were cash-ins. Several of the best series carried on in '94, including previously mentioned volumes of Chill Out and Die, Emit compilations, Ambient Dub and From Here to Tranquility. The excellent Excursions and Ambience series continued on Astralworks, albeit with an emphasis on licensed tracks this time, including favourites from Spacetime Continuum, Pete Namluke, Seefeel and Aphex Twin. In the latter case, track 19, Stone in Focus from Selected Ambient Works 2, a minor masterpiece and the track's only availability on CD right up to 2024. Although there are some exclusives, including a lovely bleepy piece from Grain, some unreleased Bill Laswell and a Lifeforms outtake from FSOL called Deep Into Your Subconscious I Slide. Trans-Europe Express carried on and some new series also began. The United States of Ambient series on US label Moonshine Music, largely collecting ambient trance and containing some real obscurities. Ambient Senses on Jumpin' and Pumpin', ambient techno compilations which, despite having rights to the early FSOL catalogue, only contains one of their tracks, as well as some reasonable one-offs like Rumour Records' Ambient Auras, Diverse Dimensions in Ambient Dub, which is surprisingly low on ambient dub, but does feature some worthwhile tracks from the likes of Biosphere, Aphex, HIA and Alter Ego, plus an early appearance from the Chemical Brothers under their original Dust Brothers name. Most notable of the bunch is Virgin's Ambient series, coming to a close with Ambient 4 Isolationism. The third volume came out earlier in '94, entitled The Music of Changes, with the usual mix of classic ambient and a handful of contemporary names, but the fourth volume was a huge change. Seemingly noticing the change in direction of some artists in the scene, range coordinator Simon Hopkins commissioned Kevin Martin, probably best known as The Bug and at the time one half of Virgin and Techno Animal with Justin Broadrick, to create a compilation of dark ambient, drone, ambient noise, ambient and post-rock for the series. I'm always amazed at how forward-thinking and brave this move was. Not that this was a completely new style of music, with plenty of tracks on the compilation being many years old, and contemporary artists like Thomas Kona having been active for some years, but the decision for a major label to strike out against the dayglow fluffiness of ambient house and embrace this startlingly uncommercial sounds of this compilation was incredibly bold, and one that impresses me to this day. The album's liner notes decry the sanitisation of ambient, lamenting the ubiquity of birdsong and whale calls within this new mu-ziq. Bizarrely, a quote attributed to FSOL is noted as ironic in contrast with the band's supposed neutrality of sound, despite FSOL presenting some of the more experimental and confrontational pieces in the ambient house canon. Their late '94 album ISDN would prove Kevin Martin to be far off the mark in his assessment. None of the artists on Ambient 4 or Isolationism would come close to recreating the commercial success of the ambient house scene, but as the chill-out rooms closed and many of the artists involved moved back to more beat-based endeavours, much of the new face of ambient could be found in this compilation. Labels like Touch, Ash International, Cranky and Millet Plateau would help develop a new face of ambient, and it's one that persists right through to today, with a remarkably purist attitude being present in the genre's online presence. The ambient subreddit forbids the posting of any material with beats, for example. A couple of names not especially associated with ambient music did put out some vaguely relevant material in '94. After the release of their acclaimed debut Dub No Bass With My Head Man at the start of the year, Underworld pushed it with the Dark and Long single. Their techno sound at the time was relatively subdued, but it's the format of the single that makes it relevant here. The UK CD features 3 interconnected B-sides, the Dark Train mix, probably the best known version of the track, and for the most part an entirely new piece with a wonderfully creepy nighttime atmosphere, its blissful ambient mix, Most Hospitable, and the epic atmospheric reconstruction 215 miles, 20 minutes of wonderfully hypnotic ambient techno. Sounds recur throughout these tracks and the 3 play seamlessly, bringing to mind something closer to an FSOL multi-part single release or Orbital's later The Box EP than your standard track and remix promo package. It always makes me think of spending a night in a forest, and while not the most obvious choice for an ambient listener, the relative lack of Carl's vocals and emphasis on atmosphere makes it worth giving a shot. Meanwhile in Denmark, a new Scandinavian label opened and released Dark and Long after its initial compilation. Not restricted to UK chart rules, this version found the EP expanded to album length at a staggering 73 minutes. With only the radio edit of Dark and Long plus Dark Train from the UK version, this results in an hour of new material, including the euphoric and chilled 17-minute fan favourite Thing in a Book, the brooding Dark Hard and the eerie Burts. It's broadly more techno-based than the UK EP, but anyone who found themselves enjoying the shorter release and wanting more in that style, it comes highly recommended. Unlike many of the labels covered in this series, April, who released that Dark and Long single, was never intended to be an ambient label, perhaps a sign of the times in itself. Nevertheless, it did release ambient, especially in its early days, and among these was double muffled Dolphin's brilliantly titled My Left Side Is Out of Sync. For all the record's strengths, it did come with a hilariously pompous press release announcing that double muffled Dolphin had already released 2 tracks on the first ever Danish ambient record. Really? Nobody in Denmark had ever made ambient music before '94? And declaring the release the first Danish ambient act to release a full album for a Danish record company. Sorry, where did they say they were from again? For the most part, this is warm, beatless ambience. Though ostensibly a compilation of tracks recorded over a period of time, including 2 commissioned for obvious functional purposes according to the press release, it ties together nicely as a coherent album. Music for Babies is a truly beautiful piece of melancholic ambience with deep bass pulses. Music for German Cars is clearly Kraftwerk inspired. The Floor Above Me is emotive and reminiscent of the shoegaze tinge electronica Ulrich Schnauz would make his career off in years to come. We Are in Different Cycles leaves the album on a quietly dramatic note. My Left Side is Out of Sync might not be a mould breaker in the way some of the era's best albums are, but it's a distinctive and individual album that shows creativity and passion from Peter Fjällberg, and is the kind of record that is overdue a re-evaluation and hopefully a larger audience one day. The aforementioned first ever Danish ambient record was Boredom is Deep and Mysterious, April's first release and their addition to the growing catalogue of ambient compilations. It posits the new Danish ambient sound as one very much rooted in traditional ambient, with rhythms few and far between, and emphasis on sound, colour and space. For those after the dense soundscapes of FSOL or the high emotions of global communication, there's little of interest here, but those after ambient's initial promise of electronic minimalism might find a lot to love. Dub Tractor's album Discrete Recordings, a lovely title that harks to Eno's earliest experiments with ambient, brings a new side to ambient dub, one that puts the emphasis heavily on the ambient aspect. The beats and the bass are there, but frequently they're gossamer thin, more likely to be blown away by a sharp breeze than make your body vibrate with sub-bass frequencies. With its sparse arrangements and superb use of space, Discrete Recordings feels in some ways more closely tied to the dub techno scene that was beginning to sprout up, albeit in a quieter, more polished fashion. It might not be an outright classic, but the album offers up a genuinely fresh take on the ambient sound of the time, and at a point when many releases began to feel a little stale, this was as welcome as anything. Cycling back round to the opening point of better known artists with ambient material, Apollo 440's Liquid Cool single. The highlight of the band's debut album, the original goes beyond the slightly awkward magazine meets Underworld of the group's mid-90s sound into spacey atmospheric techno with some gorgeous samples. That said, it's the single package that's of interest here. Not known for their remixes, Deep Forest here provides some remarkably solid ambient versions of the track. The Ice Cold at the Equator mix is 50% engaging ambience, 50% techno. Their Trans Afrique Life Extension Express version and its recut by Ollie J are more straightforward dance floor fodder but with atmospheric elements. We also get an FSOL remix, although by this point they were clearly into ISDN mode, and instead of an ambient epic in the style of their 93 remixes, they instead provide a thick slab of guitar heavy trip hop. Jar Wobble's mix is, despite the expected dub bass, heavily on the melodic side of the track, a piece of dubby ambient trance that's worth hearing. For many, the draw is the 25-minute space -320 Fahrenheit biostatic ambient mix by Rhythm of Space. 25-minute remixes are rare, and this really is an epic, a vast landscape of ambient dub, whooshing synthetic wind, dramatic string chords and sparse abstractation. Honestly, only in '94 could this remix have even happened. Banco de Gaia finally put out a proper album in '94. Maya is, well, let's be honest, it's a more fashionable version of Enigma in many ways. Breakbeaty electronics with various chants and melodies taken from different places in Asia and Africa. There's still a fair bit of trancey 4-to-the-floor stuff in here too, with tracks like Gamala Dub 3 being pretty much straight up dance music with violin samples. It's an album full of wonderful ideas, but for me there's always that niggling thing that I have with Banco de Gaia, in that it's electronic tracks with samples thrown on top. Compare them with Namlook's early Air albums, which clearly use the ethnic elements as a starting point and allow them to guide the direction, composition and mood of the final pieces. Things here just seem like an awkward split between the two elements. I enjoy Laila and Heliopolis, and the title track is a decent way to end the record, but the rest, well, we'll just say it's not for me. It got Mercury nominated, and Toby Marks has a passionate fan base to this day, so whatever he's doing it's obviously right, but I just don't quite understand it myself. Perhaps it's because a lot of Banco de Gaia's music is heavily electronic sounding outside of its samples. There are some clangy FM sounds of late 80s fame still sticking around in there, but I don't have so much of a problem with the music of Loop Guru. The use of sampled drum loops and general lack of overwhelming synths helps world music samples blend in a bit more comfortably. At times they still feel a little bit like the samples are just thrown in to make the music sound exotic rather than being utilised in a fully creative way, but for me I hear a lot more depth here. The awkward mix of sounds on Duniya is far less obvious on the third chamber, which finds the group attempting to create a tribal ambient dub sound which is suitable for their sampling, which is itself less overt here too. Unfortunately, it's the same tribal ambient dub sound throughout the whole album, which feels more like a single 60-minute track with various movements than a collection of individual pieces. Still, with the use of field recordings and some subtle atmospherics in the nicely balanced mix, it's a rare example of an album that straddles the ambient dub and tribal ambient worlds perfectly. In similar territory, A Produce returned with probably his best known record, Land of a Thousand Trances. While still retaining some of the lo-fi murk that aligns the project with the post-industrial underground, the use of pulsing rhythms, such as the punchy drum machine on the title track, means it has a lot of crossover appeal. Between the tribal rhythms I found lonesome ambient pieces, plaintive synth improvisations that are hugely effective. Heart of the Dunes gets across the feeling of isolation one might struggle with in the desert landscape of the cover, although it's the gamelan clangs and haunting guitar chimes of It Comes in Waves that are the highlight here, a devastating piece of music that thankfully exists in an extended form on the deluxe edition of the album. Occasionally I stumble across a track that I just want to listen to on repeat all day, and It Comes in Waves is absolutely one of them. Land of a Thousand Trances is maybe a little rough around the edges in comparison with many of the ambient albums of the era, but there's a lot to love here and it's a great starting point for those looking to explore outside the usual corners. More than any other year, 1994 had its share of one-off projects and obscurities, and there are always interesting things to be found in the category. With a pseudo-spiritual cover so bad it could easily have adorned a Silent Records release, Mystical Sun's Primordial Atmospheres looks like it's going to be one of those two blokes with a drum machine and a sampler type affairs, recorded in a living room with no engineer to make it sound good, but showing some promise. Designed as an aid to meditation with binaural beats and psychoacoustic sounds intended to affect brainwaves and so on, it nevertheless does offer a lot of opportunity for getting lost in your own imagination. Superbly composed and mixed, it's actually a rich soundscape with various samples and instruments perfectly placed over beautiful electronics. There's so much going on in here, yet it never feels busy and cluttered, simply like a recording of a real environment with all its comings and goings, and the musical aspects are superb, with some fine chord sequences and melodic sections. Percussion is gentle and the pieces flow with progressive structures. Odd moments, like brief bursts of piano, punctuate the main pieces, and recurring sounds add a sense of unity and cohesion throughout the album. It's a kind of an album of two halves, with the first taken up by 7 individual movements of a piece called Astral Dreams, each with their own themes and instrumentation, and the second half a single 33-minute track called Journey to Samadhi. This is mostly rich with ocean waves and sine wave tones, the track most likely to contain the supposed binaural beats, and it feels like a much better developed version of Michael Mantra's Sonic Alter. The length of the piece, with comparatively little variation, does feel a little strange in contrast with the more overtly composed tracks before, but it's a fairly small complaint. Self-released ambient albums from 1994 really shouldn't be this good. A collaboration between The Grid's Richard Norris and Rocket, owner of the Ambient Soho store in London, Further was a one-off project, and its sole release, 5 Further Journeys, is a lovely low-key ambient record. Although The Grid will be remembered by most for the banjo techno monstrosity that was Swamp Thing, Norris's career has found him working with numerous respectable musicians and producing his fair share of strong material. Let's be honest, 5 Further Journeys has nothing new to say, and it's one of a number of 94 releases to be found moving away from the increasingly dense and technical ends of ambient techno to pure ambient minimalism. Soft, long synth chords, occasional twinkling arpeggios, the odd squelch and whoosh with a few spoken samples. Cosmo-Philosophical Man opens things out a little with some gentle rhythmic sections sounding like some acidic ambient techno with half the elements removed. It's not an album that will change your life, but it might find a suitable home in those moments when some peace and tranquility is required. Originally a self-released cassette from '93, Astro Engineering's Chronoglide ended up as the first release by Worm Interface. The oddly named label was the product of Ambient Soho, the Berwick Street record shop that sprung out of the huge popularity of ambient at the time. With employees including Kevin Folks, aka Strictly Kev, Open Mind Design and DJ Food, and Chantal Passamonte, aka Mira Calix, it was a hub of names and faces from the ambient and IDM scenes in the early to mid-90s. There's a kind of irony that the shop with Ambient in its name ended up setting up a label just in time for almost all of its releases to be IDM with barely a trace of ambient in them, but at least the label had a distinct moniker. Chronoglide is a decent album, and if you're into the dark, slow, ponderous end of ambient techno, you'll find plenty to enjoy here. Don't like naming names, but I will mention Tim Humphrey, owner of the marvellous Rediscovery Records, who does sterling work bringing back long forgotten or out of print records back into the present. On Discogs, Tim says of Obi-Wan's Anubis Matist, "If you like Lifeforms or ISDN by FSOL, then you should enjoy this." Now, being the FSOL obsessive that I am, comments like that are always going to feel like a challenge, but I went in with an open mind. I quite enjoyed the album, but I don't really hear much FSOL in there. The trancey synths and beats, for example, are a world away from what Dugans and Cobain were making on those two albums. There are plenty of samples and field recordings strewn over the record, but the whole thing has much more the feeling of a slightly lo-fi studio jam than the sound design and plunderphonics of FSOL. Anyway, pedantry aside, if you do fancy something that whacks you over the head with location-specific sampled sounds, you could do a lot worse than this. Airwaves was the ambient project of Mexican musician Oscar Menzel, an artist who released just 2 albums in the late 90s, although has since had music released posthumously. Rich synth pads, twinkly arpeggios, the usual sounds are all there, and while this is slightly more lo-fi than some of the bigger names of the time, it's an album I can imagine hearing on fax. Ambient Tracks is a charmingly low-key album with an understated name and a relatively short runtime of just 43 minutes, but Menzel really knew how to put a track together. Fractal Gaze is a particular highlight, a really marvellous album. Released on the legendary Berlin techno label Tresor, TV Victor's Trance Garden series was a 3 CD box set, also released as 3 separate albums. But despite the artist collaborating with the likes of Sun Electric, it's very hard to find any real coverage of him or the release. No reviews on Discogs or Rate Your Music, no comments on YouTube. The average track length of the pieces is around 25 minutes, and there's relatively little variety at play, just long, sprawling expanses of gently rolling beats and thick melodic pads, some dub-adjacent bass, broadly quite melancholic melodies. It's the kind of material that fans of 90s ambient tend to go mad for, and I've no idea why it's seemingly completely ignored. There's also a few also-rans that you might want to explore. All Blue Review by Golden Claw Musics, an ambient trance record that inadvertently broke up Pop Will Eat Itself. Ambient Acid Cutouts #1 by Tracks Beyond Subconsciousness, which does what it says on the tin. Distant Horizons by Scott Edward, unoriginal but strongly melodic ambient techno. Hall of Heads by the Sun Kings, pleasant, largely beatless ambient trance with ethnic samples. Anti-House by Anti-House, densely layered proto-dub techno from this pre-D&L and Postal Service project. And Metamorphic Illumination by Starseed Transmission, remarkably authentic Berlin school from this one-off obscurity. And with that, we have finally reached the end of 1994, a monumental year for ambient music and ambient techno and ambient house in particular, but one that also saw the rise of the types of music that would eventually supplant them. I really hope you've enjoyed this video and all of the 1994 videos I've done. Do let me know what you think of the music. I would love to hear from some Banco de Gaia fans because I still need to get to grips with what makes his music so popular, and just love to hear from anyone who has got comments about this music. There's a comment section right down below the video. There's also like, share and subscribe buttons you might like to press as well. And for those of you who use Spotify, check down below in the video description. There should be a link to a Spotify playlist that accompanies this series of videos. I'll be updating that with all the material I cover every time a video comes out. I'll be back very soon with the first video of 1995.